Welcome back to Beneath the Surface, where we unravel the most chilling, mysterious, and jaw-dropping true crime stories you won't find anywhere else. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we have a lot of twists and turns ahead. Tonight, we dive deep into the shocking double life of a woman who fooled everyone: friends, family, and even the authorities. Get ready for a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about deception. Chapter 1. The Facade. In the sleepy town of Ashton Falls, nestled between rolling hills and a river that sparkled under the sun, Margaret Greene had long been admired by everyone who knew her. Her home, a charming colonial-style house on Maple Street, was always impeccably clean, with flowers blooming in neatly tended gardens. Neighbors often remarked that Margaret had everything a woman could want: a loving husband, 2 wonderful children, and a beautiful home. On the surface, Margaret was the epitome of suburban perfection. Daniel Greene, a well-respected lawyer, often boasted about his wife's talents to anyone who would listen. "She's got it all under control," he would say, proudly displaying her abilities to organize family events, host dinner parties, and balance her role as a mother. Their children, Emma and James, had always been well-behaved, polite, and respectful. Every parent's dream. But Margaret's perfection was nothing more than a carefully curated illusion. The real Margaret, her true self, was buried beneath layers of secrets and lies, hidden from everyone who thought they knew her. Her husband, Daniel, was devoted to her, a fact that seemed to blind him to the cracks forming in their marriage. Despite his demanding career, he always made time for family dinners and Sunday afternoons at the park. Margaret seemed to be the perfect complement to his life, always supporting him, looking after the kids, and keeping their home immaculate. But things were beginning to change. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself wondering if there was more to his wife than the image she projected. Small inconsistencies began to crop up, quiet, unnoticed changes that only began to stand out when he pieced them together. The late-night phone calls, the way she disappeared for hours on end, the hurried glances whenever he brought up their future together. The first sign of something amiss came on a moonlit evening in late October. Margaret had just finished dinner and was cleaning up the dishes when the phone rang. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered it with a calm tone, but Daniel could tell something was wrong the moment she hung up. Her face had paled, and her hands trembled as she set the phone down on the kitchen counter. "I have to go," she said, her voice shaky. "It's the police." Confusion flooded Daniel's mind. Why would the police be calling Margaret? The authorities had informed her that a woman had been found dead, and her name had come up in the investigation. They weren't saying much, but there was no mistaking the weight of the situation. As Margaret tried to reassure Daniel, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had never seen her react so nervously to a situation. The next few weeks would be filled with questions, misunderstandings, and a slowly growing unease that gnawed at his instincts. Chapter 2. The First Clue. Hannah Matthews, a young woman who had been a close friend of Margaret's during their high school years, had been missing for nearly 2 weeks before the police report was filed. Hannah had always been the more free-spirited of the two, unafraid to speak her mind or challenge the status quo. She had been friends with Margaret in their youth, sharing secrets and dreams. They had drifted apart as the years passed, with Margaret moving to Ashton Falls to start her family while Hannah had pursued her own life in Clearwater. But it wasn't until the police began to dig deeper into Margaret's life that the eerie connection between the two women became clear. The first question that arose during the investigation was why Margaret had seemed so detached when asked about her former friend's disappearance. When the police questioned her about the last time she had seen Hannah, Margaret had offered vague answers. She seemed to remember the last encounter with her in passing, but appeared to brush it off as if it were inconsequential. She explained that they hadn't spoken much in recent years, but her tone was far too calm, her answers too rehearsed. "Why are you asking about this now?" she had asked the officer, her eyes flickering with a trace of fear. It was a question she would later regret. Daniel, noticing the change in her demeanor, grew more concerned. As the days passed, he had always trusted Margaret, but her behavior had begun to make him uneasy. He couldn't understand why she was acting as if nothing had happened, especially when their former friend was now missing. But Margaret insisted she knew nothing about it and had no reason to be involved. Then, a strange series of events unfolded. The police investigation took them beyond Ashton Falls, and, to their surprise, they discovered that Margaret's name had come up in connection with multiple incidents in Clearwater, incidents that had been swept under the rug. There were reports of stolen identities, fraudulent business deals, and even some unresolved criminal activities. But these allegations had never reached the public eye. Margaret's life in Clearwater had been meticulously hidden from the town she now called home. One key detail kept coming up: a mysterious hotel stay in Clearwater around the same time Hannah had disappeared. It seemed that Hannah had visited the city recently, but what had she discovered? The answer remained elusive for now, but it was clear that Margaret's secret life was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 3. A Perfect Illusion. To the outside world, Margaret's life continued to seem perfect. As a mother, she was attentive and loving, always involved in her children's activities and school events. As a wife, she was supportive and kind, seemingly devoted to her husband in every way. But as the investigation deepened, Daniel began to see his wife through new eyes, and what he found shook him to his core. It was a series of subtle inconsistencies that led Daniel to question everything. He noticed the late nights when Margaret claimed to be working, the hushed conversations on the phone when she thought no one was listening, and the odd, disconnected moments when she would simply zone out. At first, he had dismissed these small signs as nothing more than stress from balancing family life and her duties as a homemaker. But now, it felt like something more, something dangerous. Daniel started to question his own judgment. Was he just too trusting? Had he overlooked things he should have seen? He began paying closer attention to Margaret's actions, looking for anything that might explain the growing unease in his chest. One night, when Margaret came home later than usual, he confronted her. He asked her about the rumors he had heard about her involvement with the mysterious incidents in Clearwater. Margaret's response was swift, but her eyes gave away something deeper. She laughed it off, claiming that it was all a misunderstanding, a mere coincidence. But as she spoke, Daniel could sense that she was hiding something. Margaret's perfect world, the life they had built together, was starting to unravel. Daniel, desperate for answers, continued to dig deeper. He began speaking with old friends and colleagues, trying to piece together the parts of Margaret's past that she had so carefully hidden. What he discovered was more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. Margaret, the woman he had trusted with his heart, had been living a secret life, one that no one, including her closest family, could have ever seen coming. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Shadows. As the investigation pressed forward, Margaret's carefully constructed life began to show cracks, and what was once a perfect picture of suburban bliss began to unravel. What the police uncovered shocked everyone, but especially Daniel. Margaret had been living an entirely different life, one that spanned far beyond the borders of Ashton Falls. It started with an anonymous tip about a hidden identity. Investigators traced a series of aliases, and the name Marie Johnson came up repeatedly in the city of Clearwater. It seemed that Margaret had a second life, one that was not only removed from her family but also entangled in a web of deceit and illegal activities. The moment Daniel heard the name Marie Johnson, something in him broke. His mind raced back to the early days of their marriage, the long trips Margaret used to take for business. He had always assumed that these trips were related to her volunteer work or social gatherings. But now he saw them for what they truly were, a cover for the life she had been hiding. The police's investigation revealed that Margaret, or rather, Marie, had been involved in a variety of illicit activities. In Clearwater, she had worked at an upscale boutique where she had befriended wealthy clients, gaining access to their personal information. Over the years, Margaret had used her charm and beauty to manipulate these clients, stealing their identities, siphoning funds from their bank accounts, and funneling money into various hidden bank accounts across the country. As the depth of her double life became clear, Daniel was forced to confront the reality that his wife had been living a life of fraud, deceit, and manipulation. The woman who had built their life together, raised their children, and shown nothing but kindness to her community was also a criminal. A woman who had been living in the shadows, using her position to deceive everyone around her. The police found evidence of her involvement in various criminal activities, including an untraceable transfer of funds from an overseas account linked to a money laundering scheme. It was clear that Margaret wasn't just dabbling in petty crimes, she had become deeply entrenched in the world of organized crime. But even more disturbing was the fact that Margaret had been aware of the illegal activities of her lover, Richard Monroe, and had been actively participating in covering up his tracks. Richard was no stranger to shady dealings, and Margaret had become a crucial player in his schemes. As the authorities dug further, they realized that the connection between Margaret's fraudulent activities and Richard Monroe's criminal empire was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Daniel struggled to grasp what was happening. His mind reeled as he pieced together the puzzle of his wife's secret life. The more he learned, the more disillusioned he became. How could the woman he had spent years with, the woman he thought he knew so well, be so different from the person he had imagined? Chapter 5. The Affair. The affair had started innocently enough. At least that was how Margaret had framed it in her mind. Richard Monroe was a businessman from Clearwater, charismatic and successful, with a reputation that made him both admired and feared. Margaret first met him at a charity event years ago. He was charming, powerful, and magnetic. The connection between them was instant, though Margaret told herself it was just a harmless flirtation. But Richard's persistence wore her down, and over time, their relationship grew more complicated. What had started as a casual affair became an obsession for Margaret. She had begun spending more and more time in Clearwater, away from her family, convincing Daniel that it was just business. Little did Daniel know, Margaret's business trips were actually secret rendezvous with Richard, where they indulged in an affair that would change everything. Richard's influence on Margaret was undeniable. He introduced her to a world of luxury, one that she had never known before. Expensive cars, private jet rides, and extravagant hotel suites became part of their routine. But it wasn't just the material wealth that kept her coming back. Richard had a hold on Margaret, one that was psychological as well as physical. He encouraged her to embrace a lifestyle of excess, one that fed her need for validation and control. The affair soon crossed into darker territory. As Richard became more deeply involved in criminal activity, Margaret found herself drawn into his web. She started helping him with his business dealings using her charm and wit to manipulate people in the same way she had once manipulated her friends and family. She was an accomplice, not just a lover. Hannah Matthews, Margaret's former friend, had been the one person who had started to unravel the truth. Over the years, she had stayed in touch with Margaret, and their occasional conversations hinted that Hannah knew more than she let on. When Hannah had confronted Margaret about her connection to Richard Monroe, Margaret had been forced to take drastic action. She couldn't risk losing her perfect life, the life she had built on lies. Hannah's discovery was not something Margaret could ignore. Hannah had been a loose end, someone who threatened to expose her, and Margaret knew that if she didn't act, everything would fall apart. The decision to silence Hannah was not easy, but it was one that Margaret made with cold calculation. She had to protect herself, her family, and everything she had worked for, even if it meant taking a life. Chapter 6. The Dark Deal. The night Hannah Matthews vanished, Margaret made the most fateful decision of her life. She had been pushed into a corner, and her options were limited. Richard Monroe had made it clear that if Hannah was allowed to expose their secrets, everything would come crashing down. Richard, ever the manipulator, offered Margaret a solution, one that would take care of the problem once and for all. It was a deal that would change everything. Margaret knew she had no choice. She was too deeply involved in the criminal world, too entangled in Richard's schemes to walk away now. The risks were too great. So she agreed to Richard's plan. He would take care of the rest. Margaret would lure Hannah to a secluded spot, and Richard's men would do the rest. The plan unfolded as Margaret had hoped. She met Hannah at a quiet cafe in Clearwater, where they shared a tense conversation. Margaret played the role of the concerned friend, listening to Hannah's suspicions and pretending to care about her well-being. As the night wore on, Margaret led Hannah to an isolated area of the city, where Richard's men were waiting. It was a place where no one would hear her screams, a place where her disappearance would be easily covered up. Hannah had no idea what was coming. She trusted Margaret, and that trust would cost her life. Chapter 7. The Revelation. The police's discovery of Margaret's hidden safe felt like the dam had finally burst. For Daniel, it was the moment when everything that had felt out of place suddenly made sense, and the full horror of his wife's double life hit him all at once. He had spent years thinking he knew her, but the woman he thought he had built a life with was someone entirely different. Margaret had always been secretive about certain aspects of her life, but he had never suspected this. She had concealed her hidden identity, Marie Johnson, so well that even the police had been blindsided by its existence. When they unearthed the encrypted files, the messages revealed a sordid tale of fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement, all carried out in another city. But it wasn't just the financial crimes that rocked Daniel. It was the chilling discovery of her direct involvement in Hannah Matthews's disappearance. The journal that Margaret had kept hidden in the safe was the linchpin. As the authorities read through it, they realized it was a detailed confession. Margaret had written in it as if speaking directly to herself. There was no pretension, no need to lie. She had let the truth spill out in a moment of undeniable clarity. She had never planned on being caught, but now, with her world falling apart, she had chosen to write down the events leading to Hannah's murder, confessing to every step she had taken to erase her former friend from existence. The chilling final entry described the fateful evening when she had lured Hannah to Clearwater under the guise of catching up over dinner. The very words, "I did what I had to do," repeated several times in the journal, haunted Daniel. Margaret had written them with a cold detachment, as if she were speaking about a simple errand rather than the life of someone she had once called a friend. The betrayal was not just of Daniel. It was of the woman she had once been, now buried beneath layers of deception and regret. In those pages, Daniel could see how methodical she had been. She had been planning this for years, how she'd used her charm to manipulate people, how she'd allowed herself to be seduced by Richard Monroe's world of power and luxury. The horrifying realization hit him. Margaret hadn't just been a passive participant in this crime. She had chosen to live a life of deception, building a world where she was free to be whoever she wanted, regardless of the harm it caused. The police had only scratched the surface. As the investigation progressed, more evidence surfaced, suggesting that Margaret's reach went further than anyone had realized. She had not only been involved in the disappearance of Hannah Matthews, but also in a wider network of illegal operations, including money laundering for powerful criminal syndicates across the globe. The true scale of her involvement in organized crime was terrifying. The realization that Margaret had been a mastermind, pulling the strings from behind her perfect facade, was a nightmare Daniel couldn't wake from. The deeper the investigation went, the more fragmented Daniel's perception of reality became. How could he have missed all the signs? Had she been playing him all these years, leading him to believe in a marriage that was nothing but a lie? The betrayal was more than just emotional. It was a complete destruction of everything he had built his life around. Chapter 8. The Family's Shock. When Daniel finally sat down to tell Emma and James the truth, his heart felt heavy. They had already lost their mother's trust, but now they were about to lose the woman they thought they knew entirely. He had no idea how to break the news to them. How do you explain that the mother they adored, the woman who had been the center of their world, was a criminal? Emma was the first to react. She stared at him with wide eyes, her face drained of color as she struggled to comprehend the reality of what Daniel was telling her. "You mean, she's not who we thought she was?" she asked in a trembling voice. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. The pain of telling his children the truth was overwhelming. Emma, who had always been close to Margaret, couldn't fathom the betrayal. How could her mother, the woman who had baked cookies with her, helped with homework and attended school plays, be the same woman who had committed a murder? Emma's disbelief quickly turned to anger as she lashed out at her father. "Why didn't you see it? Why didn't you know?" she yelled, her voice breaking with emotion. She ran out of the room, leaving Daniel standing there, his heart sinking. James, who had always been the more rebellious one, reacted in a different way. He felt a mixture of rage and confusion, not understanding how to process the fact that his mother had been leading a life filled with lies. But unlike Emma, he wasn't afraid to show his anger. "I can't believe this," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "All these years, she was lying to us. She was lying to me." Daniel sat down, overwhelmed with guilt. He wished there was something he could do to fix it, but there was no undoing the damage. The perfect image of their mother had been shattered, and nothing would ever bring it back. Over the following days, the pain of the revelation became more real for the children. Emma stopped going to school, opting instead to stay locked in her room, unable to deal with the emotional toll. James, on the other hand, was constantly on the move, trying to drown his pain with distractions, video games, friends, anything to avoid thinking about his mother's betrayal. The emotional fallout of Margaret's actions was widespread. Daniel tried to hold things together, but it was becoming clear that no amount of effort could undo the damage Margaret had caused. The community's reaction to Margaret's arrest added more pressure on the family. Their neighbors, who had once admired Margaret, now whispered behind their backs. Everyone felt the sting of betrayal, not just Daniel and the children, but the entire town of Ashton Falls. Chapter 9. The Trial. The trial was set to begin just weeks after Margaret's arrest, and the anticipation was palpable. The courtrooms were packed every day with reporters, curious townspeople, and the families of the victims. Margaret's trial became the focal point of the nation's attention, as people tried to comprehend how a seemingly perfect woman could be capable of such heinous acts. In the courtroom, the tension was electric. Margaret sat stone-faced, her eyes occasionally glancing at Daniel, who sat in the front row. There was no emotion on her face, no remorse, no guilt, just a cold, calculated composure. Her defense attorneys worked tirelessly to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, attempting to argue that she was merely a victim of Richard Monroe's manipulation. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The prosecution laid out the facts. Margaret's affair with Richard, her involvement in his criminal enterprises, and, most chillingly, her direct role in the murder of Hannah Matthews. The jury listened intently as the details unfolded. The letters, bank records, and encrypted messages painted a damning portrait of a woman who had willingly crossed the line into a world of crime. As the days passed, Daniel began to struggle with his emotions. He couldn't bring himself to look at Margaret during the trial. The woman he had loved seemed like a stranger now, someone he didn't recognize. Each day the prosecution presented more evidence, each more horrifying than the last. They revealed how Margaret had used her children as pawns in her game, keeping them under her control while she lived a double life. The realization that he had allowed her to manipulate him for so long was crushing. Margaret's testimony, when it came, was chilling. She showed no remorse for her actions. She explained her affair with Richard in a detached, almost clinical manner, justifying it as a necessary step in her quest for more. When asked about Hannah, Margaret's response was cold. "Hannah was a threat," she said. "I did what I had to do." Chapter 10. The Final Twist. Just when it seemed that everything about Margaret's case had been revealed, a final twist left the courtroom in stunned silence. The revelation came unexpectedly, late into the trial, when a new piece of evidence surfaced, one that would change the entire trajectory of the case. It began with the discovery of a hidden file on Margaret's laptop, one that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. It was encrypted, and it took the police several attempts to crack its contents. When they finally gained access, they found more than just financial records and personal journals. What they uncovered was a series of communications that suggested Margaret's involvement in an even larger, more dangerous criminal network. These encrypted messages, some of which were from overseas, contained instructions for laundering money through several international accounts. But the most shocking part was the final series of messages between Margaret and Richard Monroe, which referenced a clean slate operation, an escape plan that would allow them to vanish from the public eye for good. The messages detailed an extensive plan to steal millions of dollars from the very criminal syndicates they had been working with, suggesting that Margaret had been planning a grand escape, one that would not only involve Richard, but also her children. Daniel's world was turned upside down when he learned that Margaret had been planning to leave him and their children behind. The revelation that she had been preparing to run away with Richard, abandoning her family and everything they had built together, was almost too much to bear. This new discovery added another layer to the deep betrayal he already felt, but it also added urgency to the case. The truth, it seemed, was even darker than anyone had imagined. The final twist came when a key witness, a former associate of Richard Monroe, testified in court. This man revealed that Margaret and Richard had discussed their plans to disappear for good, using the stolen money to start a new life in South America. The witness had overheard their conversations during a meeting months prior and had been in hiding, fearing for his life. His testimony confirmed what Daniel had long suspected, that Margaret had been willing to go to any lengths to cover her tracks. In the face of this new evidence, the defense had no choice but to concede that Margaret's role in the criminal empire was more extensive than they had initially let on. The final moments of the trial were tense as the jury deliberated. It seemed inevitable that Margaret would be convicted on all charges, but the emotional toll of the revelations was far from over. Margaret, ever the manipulator, refused to show any remorse in her testimony, and that final, cold indifference was what left everyone in the courtroom speechless. As the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Daniel could barely bring himself to react. The woman he had spent years with was now a convicted criminal, and the life they had shared was nothing more than a series of lies and manipulations. The family was broken, and the emotional scars from this trial would last for a lifetime. Conclusion. With Margaret's conviction, the trial came to a close, but the damage it had caused would resonate for years to come. The aftermath of the trial saw Daniel and his children trying to rebuild their lives, though it seemed like an impossible task. Margaret was sentenced to life in prison, and her future was sealed. Yet, in the years that followed, her name continued to haunt the town of Ashton Falls, and the emotional scars from her betrayal remained deeply etched in the minds of those closest to her. For Daniel, the hardest part was the impact on Emma and James. His children, who had once adored their mother, now struggled with the painful truth. Emma, who had been so close to Margaret, found herself distancing herself from the memories. She began therapy, working through the betrayal and learning to cope with the loss of a mother who was no longer the person she thought she knew. James, on the other hand, grew more withdrawn, his anger never fully fading. He blamed Margaret for ruining their family, and it would take years for him to heal. The town of Ashton Falls, once proud of the Greene family, was left reeling from the scandal. Neighbors who had once admired Margaret now turned their backs, unable to reconcile the woman they had known with the criminal they had learned about in court. The investigation into her connections to international crime syndicates continued, and authorities worked to trace the stolen money, uncovering more layers of corruption than anyone had realized. But for Daniel and his children, the hardest part was not the media coverage or the court proceedings. It was the emotional aftermath. They had to rebuild a sense of normalcy in a world that had been completely turned upside down. Emma and James, now teenagers, struggled with their place in the world. Their sense of identity had been shattered by the actions of their mother, and they had to learn how to trust people again. The journey would be long and difficult, but they slowly began to heal. Daniel, too, had his own battles to fight. In the years after the trial, he found himself questioning everything about his life. He had been so sure of Margaret, so convinced that they had built a life together based on trust and love. Now, all of that seemed like a lie. The world he had known, the family he had trusted, had been a facade. In the end, Daniel found solace in his children. They were his only anchor in the storm of betrayal and heartbreak. Though the scars of the past would never fully disappear, they were determined to rebuild a life that was no longer defined by Margaret's lies. The story of Margaret Greene, the woman who lived a double life, had come to an end. But for those left behind, the repercussions of her actions would echo for years to come. The story of how a seemingly perfect life could be built on a foundation of deceit would serve as a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they knew the people closest to them. As the camera zoomed out on the broken family, we were reminded that the truth is always lurking beneath the surface, and sometimes what lies beneath is more shocking than anything we could ever imagine. Lessons learned from the story of Margaret Greene. Appearances can be deceiving. One of the most profound lessons from Margaret Greene's story is that appearances often mask the deepest secrets. Margaret presented herself as the ideal wife, mother, and community member. Her seemingly perfect life was a facade designed to hide the truth of her criminal behavior. This story serves as a reminder that we should never take things at face value. People can hide their true nature behind a mask of perfection, and it's important to look beyond the surface. Trust must be earned, not assumed. For years, Daniel Greene trusted his wife implicitly, believing in the image of the perfect family they had built together. His trust was based on a series of carefully curated moments of perfection that Margaret had worked hard to maintain. The painful truth, however, was that Margaret's trustworthiness had been undermined by her lies and manipulations. This highlights the importance of earning trust through consistent actions over time, rather than simply assuming trust based on superficial appearances. The dangers of living a double life. Margaret's decision to lead a double life ultimately led to her downfall. By hiding her criminal activities, manipulating those closest to her, and creating an entirely false identity, she became ensnared in a web of lies and deceit. Living a life based on falsehoods may seem like a way to protect oneself or achieve personal goals, but it ultimately isolates the person from the truth, and it can have devastating consequences on both the individual and those around them. The impact of secrets on families. Margaret's actions caused irreparable harm to her family. Her children, Emma and James, were left to cope with the betrayal and emotional scars left by their mother's lies. Families are meant to be built on trust, but Margaret's secrets fractured that foundation. This story reminds us of the profound impact that hidden truths can have on the people we love, and how betrayal within a family can leave lasting emotional damage that takes years to heal. The corrosive power of greed. At the heart of Margaret's criminal life was greed, a desire for wealth and power that led her to make reckless, immoral decisions. Her affair with Richard Monroe and her involvement in organized crime were driven by the need to escape her ordinary life and live a life of excess. Greed is a dangerous force that can distort our sense of right and wrong, ultimately pushing us toward actions that harm others. Margaret's downfall illustrates how unchecked greed can lead to irreversible consequences. The consequences of manipulation. Margaret was an expert manipulator. She used her charm, beauty, and intelligence to control the people around her, including her husband and friends. She even manipulated her own children, keeping them in the dark about the truth. The consequences of manipulation are far-reaching. It not only damages the lives of those being manipulated, but it also destroys the manipulator's integrity. Margaret's story is a stark reminder of the dangers of using others for personal gain and the inevitable collapse that follows. The importance of personal accountability. Throughout her trial, Margaret never showed genuine remorse for her actions. She justified her behavior, blaming others for her decisions and maintaining a cold, emotionless demeanor. In the end, she failed to take full accountability for the destruction she had caused. This is a powerful lesson. True redemption and healing can only begin when we acknowledge our wrongdoings and take responsibility for the harm we've caused. Accountability is crucial in mending relationships and restoring personal integrity. The value of honest communication. Had Margaret communicated honestly with Daniel or anyone else in her life, much of the tragedy could have been avoided. Instead of concealing her feelings, desires, and secrets, she chose to keep them buried. This story underscores the importance of open and honest communication in relationships, whether with a spouse, family, or friends. It's only through honesty that trust can be maintained, and difficult situations can be navigated together. The healing power of time. While Daniel and his children will never fully recover from the devastation Margaret caused, their journey toward healing has only just begun. Time, along with therapy, support systems, and patience, will eventually help them rebuild their lives. This lesson is crucial for anyone who has experienced betrayal or trauma. Healing is a long process, but it's possible with the right support, self-reflection, and willingness to move forward. The enduring strength of family. Despite everything, Daniel and his children remain the closest thing to each other in this world. They have been through a traumatic event together, and while the road to healing is long, they are united in their struggle. Margaret's betrayal tore their family apart, but their bond has not been fully broken. This story emphasizes the enduring strength of family, how, even in the face of betrayal and heartache, family members can find a way to come together, rebuild, and find strength in each other. Outro. As we close the final chapter of Margaret Greene's story, we're reminded of the profound truth that lies beneath the surface of every person and every family. Margaret's perfect life was nothing more than a facade, built on lies, deception, and manipulation. Her tragic fall from grace not only destroyed her own life but also shattered the lives of the ones she loved the most. The lessons we've learned from her story remind us of the importance of trust, honesty, and integrity in our relationships and in the lives we build. Margaret's story is a cautionary tale of the consequences of living in the shadows, of allowing greed, manipulation, and secrets to fester in the corners of our lives. It serves as a warning that no matter how perfect someone may appear on the outside, there is always more beneath the surface. As we watch the lives of Daniel, Emma, and James begin to heal, we realize that the road to redemption and healing is long, but with time, patience, and support, it is possible. No one is beyond redemption, but true healing only comes with acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a willingness to make amends. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of Beneath the Surface, the dark side of crime, deception, and the consequences of living a double life. Remember, the truth is always waiting to come to light, and sometimes it's more shocking than we could ever imagine. If you've learned something from this story, or if it resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'll see you next time with another story that dives deep into the heart of human nature and the hidden truths we all carry.